Chapter 10. Beginning and Ending the Speech. On the night of January 26, 1988, a conductor stepped to the podium at the Majestic Theater in New York City, tapped his baton, and raised his arms, and signaled the orchestra to play. Moments later, American theatergoers first heard the dramatic opening chords of Phantom of the Opera. Today, this scene has been repeated for more than 9,500 times, and The Phantom has become the longest-running musical in Broadway history. Like most classical musicals, Phantom of the Opera begins with an overture of an orchestral introduction that captures the audience's attention and gives them a preview of the music they are going to hear. Without such an introduction, if the character simply walked on stage and began singing or speaking, the beginning of the play would seem too abrupt, and the audience would not be suitably primed for the entertainment. Similarly, most musicals end with a finale when the whole cast is on stage. Elements of the dramatic plot are resolved, portions of the principal songs are recalled, and the music is brought to a dramatic climax. If there were no such conclusion, if the actors merely stopped and walked off stage, the audience would be left unsatisfied. Just as musical plays need to appropriate beginnings and endings, so do speeches. In the beginning, or introduction, prepares listeners for what is to come. The conclusion ties up the speech and alerts listeners that the speech is going to end. Ideally, it is a satisfying conclusion. In this chapter, we explore the roles played by an introduction and a conclusion in speech making. We also discuss techniques aimed at fulfilling these roles. If you apply these techniques imaginatively, you will take a big step toward elevating your speeches from the ordinary to the splendid. The introduction. First impressions are important. A poor beginning may so distract or alienate listeners that the speaker can never fully recover. Moreover, getting off on the right foot is vital to a speaker's self-confidence. What could be more encouraging than watching your listeners' faces begin to register interest, attention, and pleasure? A good introduction you will find is an excellent confidence booster. In most speech situations, the introduction has 4 objectives. Get the attention and interest of your audience. Reveal the topic of your speech. Establish your credibility and goodwill. Preview the body of the speech. We'll look at each of these objectives in turn. Get attention and interest. Unless the speaker can interest his audience at once, his effort will be a failure. So said the great lawyer Clarence Darrow. If your topic is not one of extraordinary interest, your listeners are likely to say to themselves, "So what? Who cares?" A speaker can quickly lose an audience if she or he doesn't use the introduction to get their attention and quicken their interest. Getting the initial attention of your audience is usually easy, even before you utter a single word. After you are introduced and step into the lectern, your audience will normally give you their attention. If they don't, wait patiently. Look directly at the audience without saying a word. In a few moments, all talking and physical commotion will stop. Your listeners will be attentive. You will be ready to start speaking. Keeping the attention of your audience once you start talking is more difficult. Here are the methods used often. Employed individually or in combination, they will help get the audience caught up in your speech. Relate the topic to the audience. People pay attention to things that affect them directly. If you can relate the topic to your listeners, they are much more likely to be interested in it. Suppose, for example, one of your classmates begins her speech like this. Today I'm going to talk about collecting postcards, a hobby that is both fascinating and financially rewarding. I would like to explain the basic kinds of collectible postcards, why they are so valuable, and how collectors buy and sell their cards. This is certainly a clear introduction, but it is not one to get you hooked on the speech. Now, what if your classmate were to begin her speech this way, as one student actually did? It's Saturday morning and you are helping clean out your grandmother's attic. After working a while, you stumble upon a trunk, open it, and discover hundreds of old postcards. Thinking about getting to the football game on time, you start tossing the cards into the trash can. Congratulations, you have just thrown away a year's tuition. This time the speaker has just used the right bait. Chances are you will be hooked. Even when you use other interest-arousing lures, you should always relate your topic to the audience. At times, this will test your ingenuity, but it pays dividends. Here is an excellent example from a student speech about dreams. The speaker began by saying, "You are being chased by an object of unspeakable horror, yet your legs can only move in slow motion. Each step takes unbearably long, and your frantic struggle to run faster is hopeless. Your pursuer gets closer, and your desperation turns to terror. You're completely helpless, eye to eye with death. Then you wake up gasping for air, your heart pounding, your face clammy with sweat. It takes a few minutes for your heart and breathing to slow down. You reassure yourself that it was just a dream. Soon you drift back to sleep." By using vivid language to describe something all his classmates had experienced, the speaker made sure of an attentive audience. State the importance of your topic. Presumably, you think your speech is important. Tell your audience why they should think so too. Here's how Judith Kay, Chief Judge of the State of New York, used this method to involve her audience in a speech to the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law. We know that a child is born into poverty in the United States every 36 seconds. And we see 12.8 million children living below the poverty line. A child dies from neglect or abuse every 6 hours. A child is killed by gunfire almost every 3 hours, and the number of neglected or abused children each year would fill up the city of Detroit. These striking statistics, by citing them in her introduction, Kay emphasized the importance of her topic and captured the attention of her audience. Clearly, this technique is easy to use when discussing social and political issues such as child abuse, endangered species, terrorism, and stem cell research, but it is appropriate for other topics as well. Here's how one student handled it in a speech about starting a home aquarium. It is very hard to cuddle a fish. Fish won't roll over or fetch the morning paper. You won't find them curling up on your lap, chasing a ball of string, or rescuing a child from a burning building. Yet despite these shortcomings, 150 million tropical fish have found their way into 14 million American homes. Each year, 60 million of tropical fish are sold in the United States, and they have earned a spot next to the all-American dog and cuddly kitten in the hearts of millions of people. Today, I would like to explain how you can start a home aquarium and discover the pleasures of owning a tropical fish. Whenever you discuss a topic whose importance may not be clear to the audience, you should think about ways to demonstrate its significance in the introduction. One surefire way to arouse interest quickly is to startle your listeners with an interesting or intriguing statement. Everyone in the audience paid close attention after the speaker's introduction. Take a moment and think of the 3 women closest to you. Who comes to mind? Your mother, your sister, your girlfriend, your wife, your best friend? Now guess which one will be sexually assaulted during her lifetime. It's not a pleasant thought, but according to the United States Department of Justice, 1 of every 3 American women will be sexually assaulted sometime during her life. Notice the build-up to the speaker's arresting statement. Now guess which one will be sexually assaulted during her lifetime. This statement Notice the build-up to the speaker's arresting statement. Now guess which one will be sexually assaulted during her lifetime. This statement startles the audience, especially the men, and drives home at a personal level the problem of sexual assault against women. This technique is highly effective and easy to use. Just be sure the startling introduction relates directly to the subject of your speech. If you choose a strong opening simply for its shock value and then go on to talk about something else, your audience will be confused and possibly annoyed. Arouse the curiosity of the audience. People are curious. One way to draw them into your speech is with a series of statements that progressively whet their curiosity about the subject of the speech. For example, it is the most common chronic disease in the United States, controllable but incurable. It is a symptomless disease. You can have it for years and never know until it kills you. Some 73 million Americans have this disease, and 300,000 will die from it before the year is out. Odds are that 5 of us in this class have it. What am I talking about? Not cancer, not AIDS, not heart disease. I'm talking about hypertension, high blood pressure. By building suspense about this subject, the speaker pulls his audience into the speech. Notice how much less effective the introduction would have been if he had simply said, "Today I'm going to talk about high blood pressure." Question to the audience. Asking a rhetorical question is another way to get your listeners thinking about your speech. Sometimes a single question will do. How would you respond if a loved one was a victim of terrorism? What would you think if you went to the doctor because you were ill and she told you to watch Modern Family as part of your treatment? In other circumstances, you may want to pose a series of questions, each of which draws the audience deeper and deeper into the speech. Here is how one speaker used this method. Have you ever spent a sleepless night studying for an exam? Can you remember rushing to finish a term paper because you waited too long to start writing it? Do you often feel overwhelmed by all the things you have to get done at school, at work, at home? If so, you may be the victim of poor time management. Fortunately, there are proven strategies you can follow to use your time more efficiently and keep control of your life. When using this technique, be sure to pause for just a moment after each question. This adds dramatic impact and gives the question time to sink in. The audience, of course, will answer mentally, not out loud. Begin with a quotation. Another way to arouse the interest of your audience is to start with an attention-getting quotation. You might use your quotation from Shakespeare or Confucius from the Bible or Talmud from a poem, song, or film. Here is how one student used a humorous quotation to begin a speech about the need for political reform in the United States Congress. Mark Twain once said it could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly American criminal class act except Congress. You need not use a famous quotation. The following made an effective introduction for a speech about bird watching. It is a moment I will never forget. I glimpsed a flash of color in the thicket, and then I saw it, a Bachman's warbler. one of the rarest birds in all of America. I was so excited I could barely keep my binoculars from shaking. This statement was made by my father. He is just one of millions of people who have discovered the joys of bird watching. Notice that both of the quotations used here as examples are relatively short. Opening your speech with a lengthy quotation is a sure way to set your audience yawning. Tell a story. We all enjoy stories, especially if they are provocative, dramatic, or suspenseful. Consider the story of one student told to open his remarks about the devastating earthquake and tsunami that struck Japan on March 11, 2011. A young couple clutched their 4-month-old baby as a tidal wave smashed into their home in northern Japan. The wave caused by a massive 9.0 earthquake earlier in the day was simply too powerful. It ripped the baby girl from the arms of her parents and carried her off amidst the piles of debris. The parents could not stop weeping at the thought of their dead child. 3 days later, rescue workers were combing through the mounds of wood, metal, and rock when they heard a faint cry. Working frantically, they pulled the lost baby out of the rubble alive. Her discovery put a new energy into the search. One of her rescuers told a local news crew in a story later reported by Time magazine. Not everyone was fortunate as that little girl or as the parents who were reunited with her, but as Japan tried to overcome the devastation, any sign of hope was welcomed with open arms. Like many good introductions, this one does a double job. It arouses the interest of the audience and gets listeners emotionally involved in the speech. You can also use stories based on your personal experience. Here is how one pre-med student used such a story. She began by recounting the first time she observed doctors performing surgery in the operating room. There I stood, wearing a surgical mask in the middle of a large, brightly lit room. In the center of the room were 5 figures huddled over a table. I found it difficult to see since everything was draped in blue sheets, yet I didn't care. I didn't dare take a step toward the table. Then one of the figures called to me, "Angela, get over here and take a closer look." My knees buckled as I walked through the sterile environment. But eventually I was there, standing over an unconscious body in the operating room. The effectiveness of any story, especially a personal one, hinges on the speaker's delivery as well as on the content. As you can see from the excerpt of this speech on video 10.2 in the outline media library for this chapter, the speaker uses pauses, eye contact, and changes in her tone of voice to help draw her audience into the speech. See if you can do the same in your introduction. The 7 methods discussed above are the ones used most often by student speakers to gain attention and interest. Other methods include referring to the occasion, inviting audience participation, using audio equipment or visual aids relating to a previous speaker, and beginning with humor. For any given speech, try to choose the method that is most suitable for the topic, the audience, and the occasion. Reveal the topic. In the process of gaining attention, be sure to state clearly the topic of your speech. If you do not, your listeners will be confused, and once they are confused, your chances of getting them absorbed in the speech are almost nil. This is a basic point, so basic that it may hardly seem worth mentioning. Yet, you would be surprised how many students need to be reminded of it. You may hear speeches in your own class in which the topic is not clear by the end of the introduction, so you will know what to avoid. Here is such an introduction presented in a public speaking class. Imagine taking a leisurely boat ride along a peaceful waterway. The sun is high in the sky, reflecting brightly off the ripples around you. The banks are lush with mangrove and cypress trees. You see a stately pelican resting on a low-lying branch. You grab your camera, snap a shot, and check the result. The picture is perfect, but will it be perfect in the future? What is the topic of the speech? Nature? Photography? No. Birding? No. Tourism in the tropics? No. The student was talking about efforts to restore the natural beauty of the Florida Everglades, but she did not make that clear to her audience. Suppose instead she had begun her speech differently. Alligators, panthers, otters, brown pelicans, these and other creatures have lost 50% of their habitat in South Florida over the past few decades. Now, however, there is an $8 billion program to preserve their home in the Florida Everglades, the largest restoration effort in the history of the world. It will rejuvenate one of America's most diverse ecosystems and protect it for future generations. This opening would have provided a way to get the audience's attention, but it also would have related directly to the speech topic. If you beat around the bush in your introduction, you may lose your listeners. Even if they already know your topic, you should restate it clearly and concisely at some point in the introduction. Establish credibility and goodwill. Besides getting attention and revealing the topic, there is a third objective you may need to accomplish in your introduction: establishing your credibility and goodwill. Credibility is mostly a matter of being qualified to speak on a given topic and being perceived as qualified by your listeners. Here is how one student established her credibility on the subject of weightlifting without sounding like a braggart. Once seen as an exclusively male activity, weightlifting has crossed the gender barrier, and with good reason. Regardless of whether you are male or female, weightlifting can give you a sense of strength, power, enhance your self-esteem, and make you look and feel better. I started lifting weights when I was in high school, and I have kept at it for the past 8 years. I also taught weightlifting in several health clubs, and I am a certified instructor through Aerobics and Fitness Association of America. Using some of my experience, I would like to explain the basic kinds of weights and how to use them properly. Whether or not you lift weights, you will probably be more interested in the speech when you realize that the speaker knows what she is talking about. Your credibility need not be based on first-hand knowledge and experience. It can come from reading, from classes, from interviews, from friends, and in these cases, I have been interested in the myth of Atlantis for several years, and I have read a number of books and articles about it. The information I'm going to share with you today comes mostly from my biology class and an interview with Reina Vasquez of the local Audubon Society. Whatever the source of your expertise, be sure to let the audience know. Establishing your goodwill is a slightly different challenge. It is often crucial outside the classroom, where speakers have well-established reputations and may be identified with causes that arouse hostility among listeners. In such a situation, the speaker must try to diffuse that hostility right at the start of the speech. Occasionally, you may have to do the same thing in your classroom speeches. Suppose you advocate a potentially unpopular position. You will need to make a special effort to ensure that your classmates will consider your point of view. This is how one student tried to minimize her classmates' opposition in the introduction of a speech urging them to change the way that they use their cell phones. Now don't worry, I'm not going to try to persuade you or abandon your constant companion. I still use mine on a regular basis, and I probably always will. But I do hope to persuade you to make one simple change in the way that you use your cell phone. A change that will protect your health and could even make the difference between a long life and a premature death. The speaker was clear about her intentions and reasonable in her expectations. By the end of the introduction, the audience knew she had their best interest at heart. Preview the body of the speech. As we saw in Chapter 3, most people are poor listeners. Even good listeners need all the help they can get in sorting out a speech's ideas. One way to help your listeners is to tell them in the introduction what they should listen for in the rest of the speech. Here's an excellent example from a speech by the U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates at the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, on February 25, 2011. Today, I'd like to focus on 3 interrelated issues: the future of conflict and the implications for the Army, how best to institutionalize the diverse capabilities that will be required, and the kinds of officers the Army will need for the 21st century. After this introduction, there was no doubt about Gates' topic or the main points he would cover in his speech. In some types of persuasive speeches, you may not want to reveal your central idea until later in the speech. But even in such a situation, you must be sure your audience is not left guessing about the main points they should listen for as the speech unfolds. Nearly always, you should include a preview statement like the following. The goal of my speech today is to inform you about Ramadan, specifically its history and practices. In the end, I hope you'll have a better understanding of this sacred time for Muslims in the United States and around the globe. I am convinced that we need to take action to combat the problem of phony pharmaceuticals. Later in my speech, I'll share a plan with you for curbing the spread of these dangerous drugs. But let's start by taking a closer look at the problem. Preview statements such as these serve another purpose as well. Because they usually come at the very end of the introduction, they provide a smooth lead in the body of the speech, the signal that the body of the speech is about to begin. There is one other aspect you might want to cover in previewing your speech. You can use your introduction to give specialized information, definitions, or background that your listeners will need if they are to understand the rest of the speech. Often, you can do this very quickly, as in the following example. A triathlon is a race made up of 3 different events completed in succession. The events are usually swimming, biking, and running, though canoeing is sometimes substituted for one of these. In other circumstances, you may have to explain an important term in more detail. Here's how one student handled the problem in a speech about the Underground Railroad used by slaves to escape from the South before the Civil War. The term Underground Railroad was first used about 1830, but in fact the Underground Railroad was neither underground nor a railroad. It was an informal network that provided runaway slaves food, clothing, directions, and places to hide on their escape routes to the North and to Canada. Why was it called the Underground Railroad? Because of its secrecy and because many of the people involved used railroad terms as code words. Hiding places, for example, were called stations, and people who helped the slaves were called conductors. Over the years, the Underground Railroad helped thousands of slaves make their way from bondage to freedom. Sample introduction with commentary. So far, we have seen many excerpts showing how to fulfill various objectives of an introduction. Now, here is a complete introduction from a student speech. The side comments indicate the principles used in developing the introduction speech. For my Aunt Josephina, life can be empty, even though she's surrounded by tons of stuff. Walking into her living room, you'll see stacks of magazines and newspapers, piles of clean and dirty laundry, and boxes of collectible figurines. But you won't find a place to sit down. In her kitchen, you'll see towers of dishes, scores of empty 2-liter bottles, and over a dozen trash bags, but you won't see a kitchen table. Some people say that Aunt Josephina is lazy. Others say she's just dirty, but my family and I know the truth. Aunt Josephina suffers from a mental disorder known as Collier's syndrome, or dysposophobia. But you probably know it by its most common name, compulsive hoarding. Those who suffer from compulsive hoarding can't bring themselves to get rid of anything. It doesn't matter if the things are valuable. It only matters that they hold on to them. Over the years, my family and I have become painfully aware of what life is like for a compulsive hoarder. But until researching the topic for this speech, I had no idea how widespread this disorder was. Gail Stetsky and Randy Frost, authors of Stuff, Compulsive Hoarding and the Meaning of Things, report that anywhere from 6 million to 15 million Americans are compulsive hoarders. Today, I would like to introduce to you the world of compulsive hoarding. I will show you the seriousness of the problem and the impact it can leave on individuals and families, and the ways it can be treated. The commentary. The speaker uses a story to gain attention. This story works particularly well because it is richly detailed and it is high in human interest. The frequent use of you helps relate the story to the audience. Now the speaker reveals her topic and defines the meaning of hoarding. The way that she gradually reveals Aunt Josephina's malady helps build the audience's interest. Her personal involvement with the topic increases her credibility and goodwill. The speaker uses statistics to show the importance of her topic. Mentioning her research for the speech further bolsters her credibility. The introduction ends with a clear preview of the main points to be discussed in the body. Tips for the introduction. Keep the introduction relatively brief. Under normal circumstances, it should not constitute more than 10 to 20% of your speech. 2. Be on the lookout for possible introductory materials as you do your research. File them with your notes so they will be handy when you are ready for them. 3. Be creative in devising your introduction. Experiment with 2 or 3 different openings and choose the one that seems most likely to get the audience interested in your speech. 4. Don't worry about the exact wording of your introduction until you have finished preparing the body of the speech. After you have determined your main points, it will be much easier to make final decisions about how to begin the speech. 5. Work out your introduction in detail. Some teachers recommend that you write it out word for word. Others prefer that you outline it. Whichever method you use, practice the introduction over and over until you can deliver it smoothly from a minimum of notes and with strong eye contact. 6. When you present your speech, don't start talking too soon. Make sure the audience has quieted down and is focused on you before you begin. Establish eye contact with the audience, smile, and then launch into your opening words. Give yourself every chance to make sure your introduction has the impact desired. The conclusion. Great is the art of beginning, said Longfellow, but greater the art is of ending. Longfellow was thinking of poetry, but his insight is equally applicable to public speaking. Many a speaker has marred an otherwise fine speech by a long-winded, silly, or antagonistic conclusion. Your closing remarks are your last chance to drive home your ideas. Moreover, your final impression will probably linger in your listeners' minds. Thus, you need to craft your conclusion with as much care as your introduction. No matter what kind of speech you are giving, the conclusion has two major functions. One, to let the audience know you are ending the speech. Two, to reinforce the audience's understanding of or commitment to the central idea. Let's look at each. This signal the end of the speech. It may seem obvious that you should let your audience know that you are going to stop soon. However, you will almost certainly hear speeches in your class in which the speaker concludes too abruptly that you are taken by surprise. Too sudden an ending leaves the audience puzzled and unfulfilled. How do you let an audience know your speech is ending? One way is through what you say in conclusion. My purpose has been. Let me end by saying. These are all brief cues that you are getting ready to stop. You can also let your audience know the end is in sight by your manner of delivery. The conclusion is the climax of a speech. A speaker who has carefully built to a peak of interest and involvement will not need to say anything like in conclusion. By the use of the voice, its tone, pacing, intonation, and rhythm, a speaker can build the momentum of a speech so that there is no doubt when it's over. One method of doing this has been likened to a musical crescendo. As in a symphony in which one instrument after another joins in until the entire orchestra is playing, the speech builds in force until it reaches a zenith of power and intensity. This does not mean simply getting louder and louder. It is a combination of many things, including vocal pitch, choice of words, dramatic content, gestures, pauses, and possibly loudness. A superb example of this method is the memorable conclusion to Martin Luther King's "I've Been to the Mountaintop," the speech he delivered the night before he was assassinated in April 1968. Speaking to an audience of 2,000 people in Memphis, Tennessee, he ended his speech with a stirring declaration that the civil rights movement would succeed despite the many threats on his life. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as people will get to the promised land. I'm so happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Another effective method might be compared to the dissolve ending of a concert song that evokes deep emotions. The song seems to fade away while the light on the singer shrinks gradually to a smaller and smaller circle until it lights only the face, then the eyes. Finally, it's a pinpoint and disappears with the last note of the song. Here is a speech ending that does much of the same thing. It is from General Douglas MacArthur's moving farewell to the cadets at the U.S. Military Academy. In my dreams, I hear again the crash of guns, the rattle of musketry, the strange mournful mutter of the battlefield. But in the evening of my memory, I always come back to West Point. Always there echoes and re-echoes, duty, honor, country. Today marks my final roll call with you, but I want you to know that when I cross the river, my last conscious thoughts will be of the corpse and the corpse. I bid you farewell. The final words fade like the spotlight, bringing the speech to an emotional close. You may think that you couldn't possibly end a speech with that much pathos, and you'd be right. MacArthur was an eloquent speaker discussing a grave issue with extraordinary poignance. This combination rarely occurs, but that doesn't mean you can't use the dissolve ending effectively. One student used with great effect in a speech about immigrant experience in the United States. During the body of the speech, the student spoke about the numbers of immigrants and the challenges they faced. Then, in her conclusion, she created a moving dissolve ending by evoking the emotional images of her grandfather's arrival in the United States. On a recent trip to Ellis Island, where my grandfather first stepped on American soil, I saw his name etched into the wall along with the names of tens of thousands of other immigrants. I saw the entry hall where he lined up to process his forms. I saw the room where he underwent a physical examination. I sensed the fear and insecurity he must have felt, but I could also sense his excitement as he looked forward to life in a land of opportunity, a land he came to think of as home. Both the crescendo and the dissolve endings must be worked out with great care. Practice until you get the words and timing just right. The benefits will be well worth your time. Reinforce the central idea. The second major function of a conclusion is to reinforce the audience's understanding of or commitment to the central idea. There are many ways to do this. Here are the ones you are most likely to use. Summarize your speech. Restating the main points is the easiest way to end a speech. One student used this technique effectively in his persuasive speech about the AIDS epidemic in Africa. In conclusion, we have seen that the AIDS epidemic is having a devastating effect on African society. The entire adult generation is slowly being wiped out. An entirely new generation of AIDS orphans is being created. Governments in the nations most afflicted have neither the resources nor the expertise to counter the epidemic. Many African economies are being crippled by the loss of people in the workplace. Before it's too late, the United Nations and developed countries need to increase their efforts to halt the epidemic and bring it under control. The lives and well-beings of tens of millions of people hang in the balance. The value of a summary is that it explicitly restates the central idea and main points one last time. But as we shall see, there are more imaginative and compelling ways to end a speech. They can be used in combination with a summary or at times in place of it. End with a quotation. A quotation is one of the most common and effective devices to conclude a speech. Here is a fine example from a speech on volunteering for big brothers or big sisters. None of us have the extra time that we'd like, but whatever time you can spare, you'll be making a world of difference in the life of an underprivileged child. In the words of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, give what you have to someone, it may be better than you dare to think. The closing quotation is particularly good because its urgency is exactly suited to the speech. When you run across a brief quotation that so perfectly captures your central idea, keep it in mind as a possible conclusion. Make a dramatic statement. Rather than using a quotation to give your conclusion force and vitality, you may want to devise your own dramatic statement. Some speeches have become famous because of their powerful closing lines. One is Patrick Henry's legendary Liberty or Death oration. It takes its name from the final sentences Henry uttered on March 23, 1775, as he exhorted his audience to resist British tyranny. Life is so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it. Almighty God, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Although your classroom speeches are not likely to become famous, you can still rivet your listeners as Henry did, with a dramatic concluding statement. What follows is a particularly striking example from a speech on suicide prevention. Throughout the speech, the student referred to a friend who had tried to commit suicide the previous year. Then, in the conclusion, she said, "My friend is back in school participating in activities she never did before and enjoying it. I'm happy and proud to say she is still fighting for her life, and even happier that she failed to kill herself. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today trying to help you. You see, I am my friend, and I am more than glad to say I've made it." As you can imagine, the audience was stunned. The closing lines brought the speech to a dramatic conclusion. The speaker made it even more effective by pausing just a moment before the last words and by using her voice to give them just the right inflection. Refer to the introduction. An excellent way to give your speech psychological unity is to include by referring to the ideas in the introduction, is to conclude by referring to ideas in the introduction. Here is how one student used the method in her speech about carbon monoxide poisoning. Introduction. It was supposed to be a time of celebration. 5 friends had gathered in a South Florida hotel room to celebrate a birthday. Jushin Marshall, one of the 5, was turning 19, but the day after the birthday party, a maid passing by the hotel room glanced through a window and saw 5 dead bodies. All 5 friends had been killed. Their killer was silent, invisible, odorless, and tasteless. Their killer was carbon monoxide. The friends had left their car running in a carport directly beneath their hotel room. Carbon monoxide seeped into the room and took their lives, as it does the lives of 400 people a year in the United States. In the body of her speech, the student looked in detail at the problem of the carbon monoxide poisoning and explained ways to head off the problem. Then, in her closing words, she tied the whole speech together by returning to the story described in her introduction. Conclusion. Remember those 5 friends I mentioned in the introduction of my speech? Their deaths were tragic and unnecessary. I hope the information I have provided today will help you avoid their fate. By understanding where carbon monoxide comes from, by recognizing the warning signs of carbon monoxide poisoning, and by following simple preventative steps I've discussed, you can make sure that you don't fall victim to the silent killer. Summarizing the speech, ending with a quotation, making a dramatic statement, and referring to the introduction. All these techniques can be used separately, but you have probably noticed that speakers often combine 2 or more in their conclusions. Actually, all 4 techniques can be fused into one. For example, a dramatic quotation that summarizes the central idea while referring to the introduction. One other concluding technique is making direct appeal to your audience for action. This technique applies only to a particular type of persuasive speech, however, and will be discussed in Chapter 16. The 4 methods covered in this chapter are more appropriate for all kinds of speeches and occasions. Sample conclusion with commentary. How do you fit these methods together to make a conclusion? Here is an example from the speech about compulsive hoarding, whose introduction we looked at earlier, page 195. Conclusion. Today, we have seen that compulsive hoarding is a serious mental disorder whose effects can be devastating for individuals and families. It is also difficult to treat, which means that millions of Americans are left living a life of clutter and chaos. My aunt, Josephina, is one of those people. She says, "People look at my apartment and know I have a problem. I look at my apartment and know I have a problem. I'm trying to get it under control, but it's really a long road. For my Aunt Josephina and millions of others, the good news is that understanding the problem is a first step towards conquering all the stuff. Commentary. The speaker gives an excellent summary of her speech. This is particularly important when speaking to inform because it gives you one last chance to make sure the audience remembers your main points. By referring to her Aunt Josephina, whom she had mentioned in her introduction, the speaker unifies the entire speech. The quotation from Aunt Josephina and the speaker's final sentence end the speech on a strong note. Tips for the conclusion. 1. As with the introduction, keep an eye out for possible concluding materials as you research and develop the speech. 2. Conclude with a bang, not a whimper. Be creative in devising a conclusion that hits the hearts and minds of your audience. Work on several possible endings and select the ones that seems likely to have the greatest impact. 3. Don't be long-winded. The conclusion will normally make up no more than 5 to 10% of your speech. 4. Don't leave anything in your conclusion to chance. Work it out in detail and give yourself plenty of time to practice delivering it. Many students like to write out the conclusion word for word to guarantee it just right. If you do this, make sure you can present it smoothly, confidently, and with feeling, without relying on your notes or sounding wooden. Make your last impression as forceful and as favorable as you can. Summary. First impressions are important. So are final impressions. This is why speeches need strong introductions and conclusions. In most speech situations, you will need to accomplish 4 objectives with your introduction. Get the attention and interest of the audience, reveal the topic of your speech, establish your credibility and goodwill, and preview the body of the speech. Gaining attention and interest can be done in several ways. You can show the importance of your topic, especially as it relates to your audience. You can startle or question your audience or arouse their curiosity. You can begin with a quotation or a story. Be sure to state the topic of your speech clearly in your introductions so the audience knows where the speech is going. Establishing credibility means that you tell the audience why you are qualified to speak on the topic at hand. Establishing goodwill may be necessary if your point of view is unpopular. Previewing the body of the speech helps the audience listen effectively and provides a smooth lead into the body of the speech. The first objective of a speech conclusion is to let the audience know you are ending, which you can do by your words or by your manner of delivery. The second objective of a conclusion is to reinforce your central idea. You can accomplish this by summarizing the speech, ending with a quotation, making a dramatic statement, or referring to the introduction. Sometimes you may want to combine 2 or more of these techniques. Be creative in devising a vivid, forceful conclusion.